Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Thank you for making the time to be here on a Friday. My name is Edith de Guzman. I am the Director of Research at Tree People. I am also a PhD student at the UCLA Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this event today. For those of you who don't know much about Tree People, we are in our 47th year, and we have our beautiful home here in Coldwater Canyon Park. Our mission is to inspire, engage, and support people to take personal responsibility for the urban environment, making it safe, healthy, fun, sustainable, and resilient, and to share the process. And this event today really is in line with that, as I think you will see shortly. In terms of logistics, just so you're all aware, we are not taking a break today. So if you need to use the restroom, if you need to get up and get water, go ahead and do that, please. Restrooms are on the other side of this wall, so just go outside and you'll find them. We are recording the event, so if you have any issues with that, or if you're a vampire and you're afraid that you're not going to show up, just let me know separately. Let me go ahead and turn it over to my partner in crime on this, who will tell you a little bit about herself and about the project that preceded this, which provided the foundation for what we're going to hear today.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Michelle Romolini. I'm the Managing Director of the Center for Urban Resilience at Loyola Marymount University. And for those of you who aren't familiar with us, we are a small Jesuit university focused on really on serving through our research. So we conduct urban ecology to empower communities. That's our mission statement. Basically, we conduct applied research directly in service to a community that will come to us with questions that they need answered in order to make decisions. So again, this falls really well within our mission, and we've partnered with Tree People. It's been a long-standing interest of ours to partner with Tree People. We've been trying to get this going for years, since I came out here 6 years ago. And as Edith alluded to, when I did come out here 6 years ago, I was a postdoctoral research fellow with the center. And one of the projects I had worked on in my graduate studies had been with this team that we are going to hear from today. So I went to the University of Vermont, and there's a very strong spatial analysis program there. And I just learned and was able to use the data sets that they had produced for Baltimore City in understanding urban tree canopy, and really using the urban tree canopy data that you're going to see today to underlie all sorts of applications, research into concerns about equity, into concerns about urban tree canopy change over time, and just probably dozens of other things that I can't think of right now. So this team is made up of folks that we'll introduce as we go along, but they've done this work in near 100 or something cities around the country, and it's a really powerful tool for urban forestry. And we had actually worked with them on the coastal analysis. So if you're familiar, in 2015, we worked with this team to release an analysis of coastal Los Angeles. Just kind of due to data constraints at the time, we focused on an area where data were available. And our goal was to expand out to the county. And with the partnership with Tree People, we've been able to do that. So we're just really excited to be able to present this to you today.
All right, thank you, Michelle. So I'd like to first of all acknowledge the U.S. Forest Service, which provided the funding for this project, and I'd also like to acknowledge CAL FIRE, who's in the room, who helped to administer the funding from the U.S. Forest Service. Without them, this would have never happened and we would not be here. So why do this project? Why did we feel that it was time to bring these data to Los Angeles? I think of it like this. If you have a stomach ache and you don't know why you have it, it could be something that you ate, or it could be something much more serious. You don't know what to do. You don't know what the next action that you should take should be. And in Los Angeles, unfortunately, we have a lack of information about our urban forest canopy. So without understanding what it is and what actions we can take, we're ill-informed to actually make plans for the future. I also sort of think of it like this. We are fish. As Angelenos, we are fish in a pond that is polluted and getting hotter. And without trees to shade that pond, the pond is not only going to get hotter, but we also don't have the opportunity to have the nice filtration of air contamination and water contamination. So we're trying to help our little pond here, and these data will help us toward that end. A couple of words about the scope of the project. The scope here was really to do the assessment and prioritization, and our following speakers will give you lots of detail about the assessment and prioritization processes that they undertook. The scope was not to create an online tool or produce an analysis for every municipality, but the data actually allow us to think toward that. So we would love to collaborate with folks who would like to see that as a next step, but we do not have currently an online tool or extremely detailed analyses for every municipality. However, we will have about, maybe nearly half a terabyte of data, quarter to half a terabyte of data to build off of, and it's going to be a fun opportunity to dive into that in the near future. We will have a forthcoming report. We will also have a web page that will have this recording, the presentations, and the report up on it, so we will have that up soon. All right, the agenda for today, let me just actually put this up on our... Can I do both things? Probably not. Good news, we're almost done with the welcome portion. We will then hear from Jarlath O'Neill Dunn for a presentation about the actual assessment. We will follow that up with 2 to 3 brief questions, because then we will be hearing from Dr. Dexter Locke, who will talk to us about the prioritization work that he led. Again, 2 to 3 brief questions after that. Finally, Mike Galvin will speak, and again, 2 to 3 questions. And then we really want to reserve a good chunk of time for discussion, because this is going to be thought-provoking, and we want to hear from you what you think and how you foresee yourself using these data. So it is now my pleasure to go ahead and introduce our first speaker, who provided me with the shortest bio possible, which is fantastic. Dr. Are you a doctor? Nearly doctor. Jarlath O'Neill Dunn is the director of the University of Vermont's Spatial Analysis Laboratory and holds a joint position as a research scientist with the USDA Forest Service. Jarlath?
Well, thanks so much, Edith, and for Tree People for bringing me out here. I was a resident of the West Coast for 3 years, and you probably don't even need to know that I'm from Vermont. I tried to get here a few days early because my brothers lived in LA for about 15 years, just to try to get a little color back, because when you walk around in LA and you've just come from Vermont, where we had a dusting of snow on the ground in April, people are constantly coming up to you, "Are you okay? You look really pale. Is there someone I can call?" So yes, I feel fine. I'm just from the East Coast. So anyway, it's really exciting to be here and to talk about this assessment. And so the team I lead at the University of Vermont works with the Forest Service and my colleagues, Mike and Dexter, who you'll hear from later, in doing these assessments for cities throughout America. And really what we're about here is, as Edith mentioned, inventorying your tree canopy. And we're doing that from above, right? If you run a business and you don't know what you have, how do you begin to make decisions about that? And if you don't know what your opportunities are, how do you decide what you're going to do? So we need to give you some base information. We then need to summarize that information to make it easy for you to digest it, right? So that you can ask questions and easily get back answers. Dexter's going to talk to you about how we can integrate these data to prioritize, and then Mike's going to follow up with some insights about your urban tree canopy. And we really encourage you to think about questions that you want answers to. And because, as Edith mentioned, we're generating so much data for this, and you have such a rich landscape and such a rich social diversity out here, there's no way we can tell you everything about your urban forest, and especially how it relates to your people. But think about what kind of questions you have about your urban forest, and then we hope that these data make it easy for you to make better decisions going forward. Don't think of this presentation right here as the finish line. Think of it really as the starting line. So why do we care about trees? I think a lot of us are here because we know these things, and there's so much more we could go into here, but everything from providing wildlife habitat to encouraging us to be outside more and develop social cohesion, reducing stormwater runoff, right, helping with reduce the urban heat island, air quality, right, all these benefits, ecosystem services that trees provide us, right? They're incredibly integral to our communities. And if we want to understand tree canopy, right, we need to map it. And of course, there's a lot of value in doing that from the ground, doing things like street tree inventories, looking at the size of trees and the species. But if we really want to understand our tree canopy over a massive area like the city or county of Los Angeles, the only efficient way to do that is from above. And so that's what my team specializes on, mapping the tree canopy from above. I was trained in traditional forestry, and now I do forestry from the soft glow of my computer monitor, but I try to keep the beard so that people still think I'm a real forester at times. So it's important to note that these projects are never possible, these tree canopy mapping projects, without excellent data, okay? And so the County of Los Angeles has invested large amounts of money in the data that make these assessments possible. And this is some of that data right here, high resolution imagery. This is a natural color image. This is the stuff if you go into Google Earth or Google Maps, right, you'll see imagery like this. But what's also neat is they spend some money to do what we call color infrared imagery here. And the reason being is that vegetation reflects a lot of near infrared light. And so what you'll notice here, if we flip back and forth between these two, is that the trees really jump out when we look at light that we as humans cannot see. And the purpose of this isn't to turn this into a remote sensing lecture, but for those of you that are in positions of power or advocating for things, and when you hear about these requests for data, this is why you want to say, yes, we need to fund these initiatives, because without these data, none of this mapping happens. And then we also have something else really neat, called LiDAR, short for light detection and ranging. Some of you may have gotten speeding tickets at times in your life from police officers who are using LiDAR, but when we mount these sensors on planes, they can generate these wonderful 3D maps of our landscape. And don't worry, you don't have to go outside with a tinfoil hat when they're flying LiDAR over. These are safe, or we've been told they're safe at least, but they're really wonderful because in complex urban environments, the laser penetrates the shadow because this is being emitted by the sensor. It's not like light, which is reflected energy. And so we can see through the shadows, particularly in the downtown areas where trees might be obscured, and particularly the street trees, which we pay a lot of money to install, and we can account for those. And it's these data sets that allow us to do this very detailed, fine-scaled mapping that you see here. So the federal government does tree canopy mapping at a resolution of 30 meters. We're doing here our tree canopy mapping at a resolution under a meter, so over 1,000 times more detailed. And that's really important in the urban landscape because much of your tree canopy, particularly in the most urbanized areas, are very fine scale features, and we need to account for those. And so this is the type of mapping that we've done. Okay, we account not only for the tree canopy, but for your green, gray, brown, and blue infrastructure out there. And those are those categories that you see there, everything from the tree canopy, the grass, the shrubs, to your buildings, your roads. And this gives you an idea of not only the tree canopy you have, but we can derive some initial insights on perhaps how much room you have to establish new tree canopy. And we'll just zoom to various places throughout the county here just to show you the detail and the beauty of the mapping here. Really is gorgeous. Okay, so some key terms here. What we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about the existing tree canopy. That's what you have right now, right? Those are the trees that we see out there. Then we have this other term, the possible tree canopy. And with the possible, we're just saying there's land available to plant new trees. Now, if you're like me and you struck out at T-ball as a young man, you don't really mind if they plant trees on the baseball fields. But a lot of you who enjoy watching Dodgers games will probably get very upset about that, okay? But something like a baseball field or something like an area with barren land, those areas fall into the possible category. They may not be socially desirable, they may not be financially feasible, so it's important to note that the possible just gives us an idea of the areas that might support tree canopy. But without going to those sites sometimes and taking into account everything from the land use to things like overhead utility wires, we can't say from mapping above if those sites are suitable for trees. But once again, it's to give us an idea. Okay, so now the big question is, what percent of Los Angeles is covered by tree canopy? And we've got different answers here, depending if you're talking about Los Angeles County or Los Angeles City, right? And sorry, we didn't have enough money in the budget for the band to do the drum roll here, but city, you're at 25%, and county, you're at 18%, all right? And so these are just numbers, right? And at the end, we'll show you those numbers and, you know, sort of how they compare to other cities and things like that. But an aggregate number for either your county or city doesn't really tell you the full story. It doesn't give you the insights to make better decisions. I mean, if I told you today that your tree canopy was 30% or I told you it was 15%, would you walk out of here perhaps making different decisions? Maybe, but probably not. And especially over the diversity of the rich landscape that you have here, we really need to dig in this a little bit more. And the truth is that the tree canopy ranges widely, right? So let's just take a look at different areas here, right? We get up into the mountains, and we can have communities that have over 80% tree canopy, right? Heavily forested rural areas. We can go into downtown industrial parts of the city where we'll have entire communities with around 1% tree canopy. So once again, when we hear numbers like 18% or 25%, we have to keep in mind we're looking at a very large, diverse area, socially diverse, ecologically diverse, diverse by climate, diverse by land ownership, right? All these things influence tree canopy. And so what we want to do is we want to summarize that detailed land cover mapping that we showed you before in a way that helps you make better decisions. And in urban areas, we know that we make decisions at the property parcel level, right? So in my house, I have a large English Mastiff. He pees all over our lawn and kills all the grass. 2 doors down are the guy who manages the green at the university. Our lawns are completely different, right? This is the guy they call in when US football teams go overseas to play. He goes in and installs the turf, right? His lawn, it looks amazing. Mine looks terrible. Different management schemes there, right? We're focused on different things, okay? So the point is the decisions are made at the property parcel level, all right? I'm trying to plant all the trees I can to shade out my lawn and kill it so that I don't have to manage it anymore, and he takes great pride in his lawn. Very different management schemes despite the fact that we're close to one another. So what we can do with our detailed land cover data here is we can do things like overlay the property parcel records, okay? And then we can begin to summarize information for each one of those parcels. So here we're looking at the existing tree canopy. That's the tree canopy right now in each one of those properties, with the darker green representing higher amounts of tree canopy. Now, what's also exciting here is this property parcel information contains a whole host of other interesting things, right? From the assessor's office, we know how much that property was sold for. We know when it was built, all these types of things. And then we've got all sorts of other data, watershed, census data that we can use to make these decisions. But that's our existing tree canopy for each and every property parcel. That's our possible. This is just, we're saying there's room to plant trees. And so when we look at these side by side with the imagery in the middle there, right, we can see just the diversity that happens from property to property, right? We've got some properties with a large amount of tree canopy, and that landowner may be interested in planting trees, or perhaps they just bought a house that was built a while ago, and when those original owners went into it, they planted a bunch of trees, and so they just lucked out. And then we also see that there are properties where there's room to plant trees. Now, it doesn't mean we can plant trees again. Once again, we've got a big property in here, right, with a school, okay? It's got playing fields. We need open space at those, but there is room to plant trees there. So let's back out a little bit. We're at a very fine scale there. Let's pull out and look at things at the watershed level, right? So we care a lot about watersheds. This is how water flows across the landscape. When we care about water quality, this is the unit of analysis we want to look at, and watersheds don't care about political boundaries. So here we have some of the watersheds across the county there, and we can see the wide range in tree canopy. You'll recognize that those areas up in the hills will show a lot more tree canopy compared to those down. Lower in the urbanized areas where we see less. Now we have to be careful in looking at things like possible tree canopy over these large areas, because we do have very arid parts of the county that ecologically are probably not suited very, very well for tree canopy. So keep in mind these limits of the analysis. Just because there's a lot of room there to plant trees and there's not tree canopy there, once again, doesn't mean it's socially desirable, financially feasible, or maybe even ecologically feasible, or perhaps those are tied together, right? We could probably get some trees out there if we spent an awful lot of money, but that's not what we're looking to do. So one of the things that we really need to understand about tree canopy is who's controlling it, right? And quite often we think about trees, we think about our parks or our street trees, but we have to keep in mind that especially in a county like Los Angeles or a city like Los Angeles, we don't just have a few thousand people or a few dozen people making decisions, right? We've got hundreds of thousands of people making decisions about their land ownership and how to manage the vegetation. And so let's just take a look at some different areas in the city here and how it relates to land use, okay? And so what we did is we took the county parcel data, which has dozens and dozens of land use categories, and we aggregated into these here. So everything from residential, which is that sort of purplish color there, to commercial, transportation and utilities. You're going to notice the roads fall in this sort of bright green category there called the RAL, that's short for the rights of way. Okay, you can see the institutional land use there, all these different actors, right? And let's consolidate these into these general land use categories. And those are very different, right, if we're downtown compared to an area that's more residential and institutional, okay? If we have more educational or we've got college campuses, we're going to see higher amounts of educational land use. And so what we can do here for the county is look at these land use types, and we can summarize the existing tree canopy. We're going to look at that two different ways. One is the aggregate amount of tree canopy, okay, the total acres, and then we're going to look at the percent of tree canopy. And by percent, we mean the amount of land in that category that's covered by tree canopy. And so let's take a look here. So here we are, and there we got our laser pointer here. So this is recreational land use here, and this is for the county. So you can see that for the amount of tree canopy you have right now, that existing tree canopy, the single highest land use category within the county for current tree canopy, existing tree canopy, is this recreational category, okay? Followed shortly after that by residential. Now, if you look down here in terms of the percent of land that's covered by tree canopy, okay? Recreational very high, agricultural very high. There's just not a lot of agricultural land use in there, okay, which is why that bar is so low. But take a look at residential. So if you were to say, if we want to preserve our tree canopy within Los Angeles County right now, two land uses that are really, really important: recreational land, okay, probably largely controlled by the government, and you don't just have one government, right? You've got dozens of different government actors, some of which are the federal level, which you have very little influence over, to the state, down to the county, and then individual communities, all right? And then the residents, right? This is where you have hundreds of thousands of actors making decisions. But just take a look at the importance of these two, and then follow there by the rights of way, right? Your street trees. And then we have all these other land uses out there. But if you were to just say, you know, what do we need to focus on to preserve our tree canopy? Those are the three land use types. Now let's take a look at the possible here, right? And kind of similar things here, right? Except that the recreational and residential are flipped here, okay? That's because our recreational lands in this area are highly, like how I said we there, or our recreational lands. I've already become an LA resident during my 2 days here. Thank you, everyone. We see that these are flipped here, right? We've got a lot more room to plant on residential land. So if you want to really increase our tree canopy, right, it's convincing these hundreds of thousands of actors that they should value trees. Now, when we go to the city, things become a little bit different, okay? So that was the county, and then we go to the city. And now residents are the majority land use type for all of the tree canopy out there. So in the city, residents are more important than recreational, but they are still followed by recreational. But look how crucial residents are in the city of Los Angeles when it comes to tree canopy ownership, right? And then we get down further here to the rights of way, right? So residents, recreational, rights of way. Look at land to plant new trees, right? Once again, residential, recreational, rights of way. So we see these common themes threaded through here. Now let's take a look at some interesting relationships. And the purpose here is not to show you every single permutation of statistical analysis that we can do with these data, but to give you some idea about how we can derive insights from the robust data sets that we have. So year built and sale price here. So this is really interesting. Here we are looking at the existing tree canopy on the y-axis there, and year built on the x-axis here. And so as we go from 1900 over to our current day, and this is only for single-family residential homes here, okay, what we see is that there's an inverse relationship between tree canopy and year built, and that's largely because trees tend to not do well with new construction. So if we go in and put a new home here, typically the lot is cleared, all right? The reason is that it's very, very difficult to preserve a tree when you're doing construction because of the damage you do to the roots. So typically that lot is cleared, someone moves in, new trees are planted, those trees grow over time until they reach their life expectancy, or they get diseased, or they're blown over, all those types of things, then they die and then people tend to replant. But what you see here, right, are these fluctuations here, right? As older homes, people probably planted trees and those trees died out, or a new homeowner comes in, or maybe there's new construction, we see these fluctuations. But where we see this real big drop off is in homes in the last few years are generally going to have lower tree canopy, once again, because that relates to recent construction. Then we can also look at things like at the sale price of that home in relation to tree canopy, right? So generally homes that have more tree canopy also sell for more. And that has a lot to do with where those properties are located. This isn't going to tell us everything that we know about trees in the city of Los Angeles, okay? But these are some of the insights we can derive from this very robust data set here. So let's back out and look at things like urbanization, right? How does the density of the urbanized area, the density of the developed area affect tree canopy? And what we see on our West Coast cities, it's very, very different than those of us who come from the East Coast. So what we're looking at here are US Census block groups. And we'll go through a bunch of different analyses that we use using US Census block groups. And these are a unit of analysis. Thank you, everyone. That wasn't time for applause, but appreciate it. There's some people that are just really passionate about census block groups out there. But this is a way in which we look at the census data and we describe it by how urbanized it is. So the principal urban centers here, those are the most dense urbanized areas or most developed areas, down to the rural areas, right? And because you've got this robust county, you have the full range of urbanization here. So once again, darker colors, more urbanized, lighter colors, less urbanized here. And this is really interesting because some of your rural areas are actually much more arid environments, right? So they have less tree canopy. If we were doing this study out on the East Coast, typically we see as the area becomes more rural, tree canopy increases. But what we see here, once again, from more urbanized on the left to less urbanized on the right, the tree canopy kind of moves up and down. So especially when it comes to percent of tree canopy, actually our downtown areas, thanks to parks and robust street trees, have higher amounts of tree canopy covering their land than does the urban periphery, than do these small cities. And then as soon as we go to the suburban area, then it jumps back up again, okay? But if you look at the aggregate amount of tree canopy, most of it is in this suburbanized area, right? So people are generally close to the trees out there. It's not in the rural area, which once again, in many cases is quite arid. So this is kind of interesting. Now let's dive into something that's a little bit more tricky and sometimes can be more contentious, but looking at demographics, once again, focused by census block groups. And those of you that work with demographic data know that the US Census acquires massive amounts of information out there. Okay, and then there's also data that we can obtain because every time you swipe your credit card, we know who you are, we know where you live, and we know what you've purchased. And there are companies that integrate these data sets from the US Census with what we call your expenditures to do market segmentation data. So it doesn't matter if you're Starbucks or Walmart or Jack in the Box, before you put a restaurant somewhere, you'll make use of these data because you know who your customers are. And the point being that we don't want to necessarily figure out where we want to put a Jack in the Box, but we can use demographic data to help us derive some insights about how tree canopy relates to people based on their life mode and how we might have to employ different marketing strategies depending on the areas we may be working in for either preserving or increasing tree canopy. So let's take a look here. We'll just go out to sort of the Hollywood area and introduce you to this market segmentation life mode database here. And so out in this area here, the two categories I'll draw you to, The purple here, affluent estates. Okay, so these are generally people, we know they've got college degrees, many have advanced degrees, they've got kids, they're heavily involved in their communities, okay? All those types of things we know about them. And then right next door to them, in this sort of peach color here, if you will, are uptown individuals, okay? These folks are also educated, wealthy, but they tend not to have kids, okay? They're often renters as opposed to these people that are homeowners. These people out here we know really enjoy the outdoors. These folks here have a sense of adventure, but they're very environmentally conscious. Okay, so there's all sorts of interesting information we can tease out from these data sets. And our goal isn't to stereotype communities or to put people into a certain bucket, but we can leverage, okay, these amazing market segmentation data sets to give us some insights into things, right? And here we are looking at the tree canopy for each and every one of those census block groups. Okay, we go to different area, right? Very, very different situation here. Okay, take a look at next wave here. Okay, so these are primarily our immigrants. Right next door to them is this category called ethnic enclaves. And keep in mind, we did not make up these names. Okay, these are from these existing databases that are out there. Both communities with heavily dominated by folks with Hispanic backgrounds. Okay, difference here, primarily renters and sort of older, more multifamily dwellings as opposed to owner-occupied ones, right? So our strategies for interacting with renters versus owner-occupied may be very different. Also, our strategies for interacting with people whose English is a first language versus English as a second language may be very different, which is how we can use demographic information to derive insights. So when we look at this here and we look at who owns the tree canopy in Los Angeles County, okay, once again, this is the total amount of tree canopy in acres here. Take a look at these areas here, upscale avenues, okay, which are the very, very wealthy folks in the county in these categories here, and take a look at the aggregate amount of tree canopy. And when we're saying this, we're not saying that, like, you know, people with means suddenly, you do really well in life and then you suddenly go out and you hoard trees, right? And there's people like with, oh, where did all those trees go? Oh, Al down the street made a ton of money. He's really just got them in his basement, right? We just know that when you have money, you can move to an area, perhaps where you've got more land, right? Or you're up in the hills where trees naturally grow, and that gives you greater access to tree canopy, as opposed to perhaps if you have less means, or maybe you're starting out in life and you're living in a renter-occupied area and it's much more developed, there's going to be less tree canopy. So a lot of things going in here, but just keep in mind when you hear about those numbers, like the city has 25% tree canopy or the county has 18% tree canopy, that doesn't mean everyone does, okay? And then we go to the city here, we can see sort of that similar pattern here, okay, of people that generally have more wealth and are in that stage of life, generally have access around them to greater amounts of tree canopy. Okay, and this gets to that idea of the unequal distribution of tree canopy within the city. Okay, so here's the city boundary, and each one of those polygons there is one of those census block groups. Okay, and now what we've done in this particular infographic here is each one of these squares here represents one of those census block groups. So there's over 1,500 of these census block groups throughout the city. Okay, so this is just the city here. And then these are sized and colored due to the amount of tree canopy that they control relative to the total. Okay, so 10% of all of the city's tree canopy is in this one census block group here. Okay, you take these 5 census block groups here, which comprise less than 1% of the city's population, they control about 18% of the city's tree canopy, all right? Or I shouldn't say they control, they live in the area around that, right? It doesn't mean that all that land there is under their control. But once again, when we think about who has access to that 25% tree canopy, it's not evenly distributed here, right? And so as we get down and we just look here, right, if you just take the next row here, okay, the 16 highest census block groups, they control 27% of the city's tree canopy, right? And then you get down here, right, where you've got sometimes a lot more people and there's a lot less tree canopy. So I think these insights here will help you understand how tree canopy is distributed throughout the city. Oh, yeah, so these are census block groups. So a city or a community can have multiple census block groups. Yeah, thanks for that. Nope, that wasn't a late night typo in that particular case. So, but that's a good point here, right? So we can have, so even though these are separate block groups, they're still in the same community, right? And then we look at sort of where they're distributed, and a lot of these, right, located up in the hills, those types of things, right? And those are just sort of some of those locations there. So how can we use these data to derive insights? And let's take a look at some of the basic analyses that we can do now that we've compiled all of this information. So let's start with our census data again. Once again, here we are just visualizing it by the existing tree canopy. And just looking at this, we see some patterns, right? Up in the hills and the more suburbanized or rural areas, we've got higher amounts of tree canopy. We know these are also correlated with wealth. And then we can pull in something called the California EnviroScreen data, okay? And EnviroScreen basically indicates those areas where people are disproportionately affected by various types of pollution, okay? And in this particular case, the lower score means you're less affected, and the higher score means that you're more affected. So red being worse in this particular case, right? And we can move back and forth between these two data sets, and then we see some sort of patterns emerging, right? Lower tree canopy, higher California EnviroScreen score, right? Then we can take a look at our subwatersheds, right? If we want to reduce stormwater runoff and improve water quality, once again, you know, the subwatersheds that have lower tree canopy, and then maybe we want to focus in on that particular area and look at tree planting or tree preservation work in an existing community. So let's just choose Huntington Park here, all right? And so then we can dive into that community, and then we can repeat all the analyses that we just did at the city or county level, but down to the individual community level. And so what you see here in Huntington Park is recreational is much less important here. What we see in Huntington Park when it comes to preserving the existing tree canopy, right? Residents, incredibly important, but not far after that are the street trees and the rights-of-way there. Okay, so if you're interested in preserving tree canopy in Huntington Park, your residents and your street trees are really important right now. If we look at the amount of land covered by tree canopy, of course, the recreational areas have a lot more, but there are fewer recreational areas in Huntington Park, so they're not contributing as much tree canopy to that community as some other ones. Okay, then we can look at the possible there. Who's got room to plant trees, right? Once again, this theme of residential and rights-of-way comes out. You know, we've got certainly commercial there, but really this is about the residents here. Okay, they've got the most of the land to plant new tree canopy. So if you're interested in making substantial gains in that community, that's where you've got the most room to do that. And then we can dive into the demographic analysis here, right? And this is that market segmentation data, right? Most of the tree canopy falls into this group, Las Casas here. What do we know about these folks? Okay, we know primarily these are Hispanic communities. We also know that they own their homes. They spend a lot of money on their children, right? So figuring out what motivates them as opposed to perhaps a renter who's younger, who's only there for a short period of time, who may not be invested in the community, those are very, very different things. And this reflects not only the trees that are on their land, but perhaps the trees in the rights-of-way, the street trees that they may help to care for. All right? And then if we want to back out a little bit, and we're interested in the larger watersheds that intersect this community, and there's two different watersheds there, and we think, well, what if we want to have a multi-community initiative here to improve water quality within these watersheds by addressing tree canopy? Then we can look at these two watersheds here. These are what they call the HUC, or Hydrologic Unit Code, of course developed by a government agency, so these numbers just roll off your tongue, right, when you're referring to the different watersheds here. But here we can look at the existing tree canopy and possible tree canopy in each of these watersheds. And once again, this pattern, right, if we look here, right-of-way and residence jumps out again. So what we see in Huntington Park, that pattern of the importance of the residents and the rights-of-way for existing and possible tree canopy also holds true for the larger watersheds that that community intersects. Okay, so people always ask, you know, how do you stack up to someone else? Because really what you want to do is you want to leave a meeting like this and you want to bash other communities with the great information that you have. But it's important to keep in mind that any community where you do an assessment like this, they're different. Okay, they're different based on their social structure, different based on their political structure, and also different based on their landscapes. All right, so let's take a look at San Diego, where we've done some work, right, which is more arid, right? If you look at the sort of the hilly areas in San Diego, right, tree canopy there is not really naturally growing in an awful lot of places like you have in Los Angeles County. So we see a much lower percentage of tree canopy there. Okay, New York City, no one ever believes this number, okay, but they're right around 20% tree canopy. If you've been to New York City recently and you head up to the northern parts, they actually still have old growth forests there. Okay, and then I put Pittsburgh in here, and you're probably wondering, why Pittsburgh, former industrial steel town. And what I think about Pittsburgh that's very interesting is much like LA, they have a lot of high topographic relief. And very similar to you folks, they have areas in the downtown that have very, very low percentages of tree canopy, but then they have areas in the hills with over 90% tree canopy. So when Pittsburgh gets really excited about its tree canopy number, if you look at some of the areas, they're really appallingly low, and then there's higher crime in those areas and higher heat island, and all these disamenities exist there, but overall the number comes out pretty high because of certain areas. And that's why we want to look at this distribution at very different scales, not just at the city or county level. So I'll end there, and I think we've got a time for a couple of questions. I did bring my son and his nephew, so they're going to ask some lowball ones that if no one else asks, and these will be online of how did you get so handsome? Have you always been this well-spoken? And can I have your autograph? So, yes.
Just a moment, hang on. We're gonna pass the mic around. We're recording, and this will just help us actually have better audio. So I'm gonna ask that if you ask a question, please identify yourself, name and affiliation.
So Rachel Mallard, Koreatown Youth and Community Center. My question is, based on what you just shared, did you get the number for tree canopy cover excluding those mountain areas as part of this project?
So it depends. For that, it would depend on what you define as, a mountain area, right? And I think everyone will have different definitions. The nice thing is that with these data, right, what you can do is you can choose to exclude certain census block groups or certain areas. So those queries become pretty easy, right? So if we exclude those top 5 there, right, then your tree canopy, I believe, don't quote me, but I believe it goes from like 25% to 21%, right? And then you exclude more, and then eventually you're under 20% pretty easily, right? So once again, it depends on how you're going to define a mountain area, but you can begin to just query out those ones and rerun the numbers. Or you might want to do sort of the inverse. You might want to say, hey, within this sort of core downtown area, what's our tree canopy within these 100 or so census block groups? And the purpose of this was really to assemble those data so that you can ask those types of questions. We didn't.
Landscape architect. So my question to you is, the aerial data you use probably vary in time. It's not consistent topography, not aerial data. So your orthographic photos are taken at different times. Do you use the city's development permits to balance off from whatever, 2010, 2005, to see what has been developed and maybe lay that over because they use our info and see areas that are newly developed from what was in your aerial photography? Have you done that kind of refinement?
Yeah, so let me, since we didn't have the microphone, I just want to make sure we get this recording. If I can distill that question down, it sort of gets to the temporal resolution of the data, the time period, right? So we use the LiDAR and imagery from 2016, and I know we have the County Geographic Information Officer who will correct us if I'm making any errors here. So it is important to note that by the time you start an aerial mapping project to the time you receive the data, it's already outdated, right? I mean, you folks just have to drive around here and you see the tremendous amount of construction. We do this in other areas. New York City, right? You blink and some home has gone down that was 1 story and suddenly it's replaced by something with 4 stories. So this analysis is based on 2016 data, right? And you've seen not only new construction during that time period, but you've also seen things like fires, right? And other environmental events, right? My brother who I'm staying with, you had some wind a couple days ago and an avocado tree in his yard blew down, right? All these different things. So this is a point in time. And so can you refine it using development data? Yes, I think you can. I think the best way is to continue to advocate for new updated flights so that we can begin to track things over time. And then as you track things over time, I think you'd want to bring in that development data so you can say, how is development, right? If we had a permit on these properties, has that resulted in a change in tree canopy? And that's how I'd advocate integrating those data sets. But once again, keep in mind, right here we're laying that foundation in order to track tree canopy going forward. Do we have time for one more, or should we?
We'll move on to the next two presentations. If you have a question in mind, write it down, keep it in mind, and we'll hopefully have an opportunity to discuss it during the discussion period.
Thank you, Jarlath. So it is my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Dexter Locke. Dexter is an urban ecologist with degrees in natural resources planning, environmental science, and geography. His research examines participation in tree planting programs, environmental justice, residential landscapes, and program effectiveness. Conducting applied research with urban natural resource managers is his passion. So welcome, Dexter.